Hey, this is Jamie with Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about my top 10 favorite games that feature skill test mechanisms. A skill test, just very in brief, is a mechanism in a game where you are trying to reach a certain threshold using some element or including some element of uncertainty. So, reach a threshold, element of uncertainty. This differentiates it from a cost. So, a cost in a game being where you spend three resources to attain something that costs three resources. So there's no uncertainty there. It's just an exchange of three X number of things for something that costs X. That is not a skill test. Skill test has a threshold, and there's some element of uncertainty or variability in it. Let's jump into the honorable mentions over here first. I'll discuss elements of what I think about skill test as I go through the video here. Dungeons and Dragons, Eldritch Horror, Mansions of Madness, Arkham Horror LCG, Battlestar Galactica, Graphic Novel Adventures, Flipships, The Seventh Continent, Time Stories, The Reckoners, Champions of Midgard, Gloomhaven, Istanbul, Journeys in Middle-earth, and the Pathfinder Adventure Card Game. Those are some honorable mentions with interesting skill test mechanisms, many of which I talk about in my other video about skill tests, which isn't a ranked video. It's just me talking about skill tests for a while. I'll link to that in the description below. So let's jump right into the top 10 here. At number 10, I have Dead of Winter. So Dead of Winter, very similarly to Battlestar Galactica, does something really interesting with skill tests, which is that players collaborate together to achieve the skill test. And this is number 10 because it's almost slightly outside the general category of skill tests. But basically the idea in Dead of Winter and Battlestar Galactica is that over the course of a certain amount of time, players know that they need to collectively have something. They need to have, say, 8 food. And on a player's turn, they can contribute some cards face down to a common pile and those cards may or may not be food. And at a certain time, players will look at all those cards, pick them all up, shuffle them together so they don't know which cards each player contributed, and they'll look to see how many food they have. So this is kind of it's a cooperative element where players are cooperatively collaborating to reach a threshold of 8 food. But the uncertainty is how many cards each player is actually contributing. I might say that I'm contributing a lot of food or 3 food, but what did I really contribute? And you're wondering that partially because in Dead of Winter, each player has their own personal goal that they're trying to achieve. And so I may need food in my hand for the end of the game to actually win for me, or to even be a part of the group's win. And also, there might be a trader out there. That's the same case in Battlestar Galactica. There might be a trader who is saying they're contributing food, but they're not really doing that in Dead of Winter. And so I really like this element in a cooperative game that you aren't... There are great cooperative games, some of which will be on my list, where you're doing your own skill test. The players aren't collaborating on those skill tests. But I really like the idea of cooperative games where players contribute together for a skill test with an unknown variable. The unknown variable being what each player is actually contributing to that test. So that's why Dead of Winter is my number 10 game on this list. And number 9 is Call to Adventure. In Call to Adventure, it's interesting. They use these rune tokens. They're double-sided tokens. They're not dice. Instead, you're flipping these runes up in the air and determining the outcome of skill tests. And in Call to Adventure, there's a lot of interesting choices when you decide what to input into the skill test itself. You always have a few standard runes that you're contributing. I believe it's 3 standard runes. You also have some special runes based on what you've done so far in the game related to your character. And you also have dark runes that you can put into the skill test if you want. And dark runes have guaranteed successes on them, but they're also dark. They can lead to a dark path for your character. And so I like the vast variety of interesting inputs that you put into a skill test in Call to Adventure. A lot of choices there as to what you're putting into it. And I also like that they didn't use dice. There are great skill tests that use dice. Some of them will be on my list. But I like that they chose something a little bit different, where you're flipping these double-sided tokens instead of rolling dice. So that is my number 9 game for this list, Call to Adventure. At number 8, I have Forgotten Waters. And this is actually where the list starts to get really difficult, because there are a lot of games that I like with skill tests that follow the mold that I really enjoy in games. And Forgotten Waters is right on the cusp of some of those mechanisms. in Forgotten Waters, it's almost a fairly standard skill test mechanism where you're rolling some dice and hoping to get a certain number. But they have a few tweaks to that make it extra special. One of them being that before you start a skill test in Forgotten Waters, you get an experience point in that skill. So going into the skill test, you are already better than when you started, and I love that about skill tests in general. If you either go generally, if you leave a skill test, that you are more informed than when you entered it. But I like that Forgotten Waters gives you that experience point going into the skill test, so you get a little extra boost going into it in terms of the dice that you can roll. Then in Forgotten Waters is the outcome, which for some of the skill tests in Forgotten Waters, it's binary. It's either yes or no. You reached a certain number or you didn't. But for a lot of them, there are variable outcomes, varying levels of success or failure. So if you end up rolling, 1 to 5, you might get 1 food. But if you roll 6 to 10, you'll get 3 food. And so you have this level of excitement where you're generally not just straight up failing in Forgotten Waters. You haven't wasted your turn, which is one of my concerns and complaints about many of the skill tests, that you do this whole thing, this involved thing, and then you just don't get anything from it. But you're trying to balance that with a level of uncertainty. So I really like those 2 elements of Forgotten Waters, that you get something going into it that makes you stronger going into the test and afterwards, and there are variable outcomes on the backside. So that's Forgotten Waters at number 8. At number 7 is Legacy of Dragonholt, which perhaps is the most streamlined of all of these skill test mechanisms. And Legacy of Dragonholt, it's a game that you can play like when you're traveling. You don't need a tabletop. There's no dice rolling, anything like that. All you have is a storybook and a character sheet. And when you encounter a situation in Legacy of Dragonholt, you are given a few options, and some of those options are limited by skills that characters in your party may or may not have. So it might say, there's always a default option that says, no matter what, you can choose this option. And oftentimes there's more than one. There might be one that says stay and fight or run away. And then in between that are varying other things. Like there might be one that says if you have the Arcana skill, you can cast a spell to fight whatever you're trying to fight right now. Or it might say if you have, usually it's skills like that. It says if you have the X skill, you can choose it and use it. And so this is the first level of Legacy of Dragonholt. Basically, you're trying to build up characters with different skills so that you have more options when you encounter these skill tests. And that's the test. The whole test, like, it's not pass or fail. It's just if you have the skill, you can choose this option. The uncertainty element of it, though, is what happens afterwards. You don't know what you're going to turn to until you actually turn to that page, until you make a selection and turn to that page. And so you really have to intuit your way out of it. Is this a good situation for me to cast a big spell that might collapse this cavern? Or is this a better situation for me to just kind of poke at the nearest ogre? Or use a different skill that might be better in this specific situation. So that level of uncertainty is really, really interesting to me in this game. It's a very narrative game in Legacy of Dragonholt. So I really like that element, that there's no calculations happening at all. It's just you choose which option you want to choose based on the skills that you have, and you deal with the outcome when it happens. So that is Legacy of Dragonholt at number 7. At number 6 is One Deck Dungeon. Hopefully Joe can put up a visual of what a skill test looks like in One Deck Dungeon, because it's a little difficult to describe, but the key to a skill test in One Deck Dungeon is that you always succeed. No matter what happens, no matter what you roll, and you're usually rolling a variety of d6 dice, no matter what you roll, you are going to succeed. You are going to move forward. You're going to beat this monster, or whatever it is. It's either a trap or a monster usually. However, the big part of the skill test is that the dice that you roll, you're going to place them on a little grid showing numbers and penalties. And the more penalties you cover up with your dice, the fewer penalties you incur. So keep that in mind. You always succeed, but if you succeed and you don't roll anything that you need, then you're probably going to lose time. You're going to lose some health. You might lose some other things because you're not able to cover up any of those bad things that are going to happen. So I always like that you're always moving forward. No matter what, when you go into a skill test, you know that you are going to move forward from it. But depending on the choices you make, which dice you roll, where you place those dice, you get to decide how hurt you are coming out of this skill test. Man, this is so clever. I love that this element of progression. You're always moving forward, but you get to mitigate the bad things that happen to you. I love that element of the skill test in One Deck Dungeon, my number 6 game on this list. At number 5, this was a tough one. Originally, when I made this list, this was actually much higher, or even higher. It's already quite high, but I knocked it down a little bit, and that is Time Stories Revolution. I love the skill test mechanism in Time Stories Revolution. It's very simple. Your character has a set skill number. I'm a 3-level fighter. And when I encounter a fighting skill test in Time Stories Revolution, all I do is I simply draw a card from a common deck. It's not a deck of my cards. I draw a card and look at how that card modifies the skill test number. And so say I have a 3 fight. The skill test is once a 5, and I draw a card that either often says like 0, it might say +1, it might say -1, it might say +2. I don't know what that card will say, but it modifies my skill level. And the outcome depends on a couple different factors on that card itself. So the skill test card will show if you have less than 5, then this happens. So this goes back to what I was talking about with Forgotten Waters, at varying degrees of success. If you have less than 5, this happens. If you have exactly 5, typically that's the best result. You want to get exactly 5, and something really good happens. Or if you have overkill, if you not only kill the ogre, but you also chop off his head a few times, that can almost be a little bit of overkill. The game doesn't necessarily punish you for it. You have still succeeded, but it might not be quite as good as that precision of getting exactly at 5. I really like the skill test mechanism. I like the varying degrees of success. I like that this little deck of cards that I mentioned, it's only 6 cards, and you can see the cards that were previously drawn. So you know that maybe the other players have drawn the -1, the -1, and the 0. So you know you have a pretty good chance of getting the +1 or the +2, things like that. So you have that level of uncertainty plus some knowledge. And you have these variable outcomes that you know going into it. You know what these options are going into the test. I really like all those different factors that go into it. Also, there's a little resource that you can spend to influence the outcome a little bit going into the test. You have to spend that before you go into the test. There's these little gems that you can spend. So I like how all of this comes together. I think the only reason that I put it a little bit lower on the list is that there's no way after you actually draw that card to impact the number. At that point, the skill test is done. You can't strive a little harder or sacrifice something to do a little bit better, which you'll see in some of the games that are even higher on this list. But I really do love this mechanism for Time Stories Revolution at my number 5 slot. At number 4, I have a very new game on this list. Here's the box. Destinies. Destinies has a fantastic skill test mechanism. It's a lot to describe, so I'll try to do it in brief here. The first part of the skill test mechanism in Destinies is that you don't have a number that you're targeting. Basically, like say I have encountered a locked door. Actually, there's so many levels to this. It's really, really good skill test mechanism. I encounter a locked door. The game first gives me some options as to what I can do. So right away, I have a choice. I can try to break through the door, or I can try to pick the lock. And the game might even give me an option to say, hey, maybe you want to use an item here. It doesn't tell me what item I might need to use, but I might flash a key up to the screen, and it might say, hey, this key unlocks the door, or it doesn't unlock the door. So often the game gives you that option too. So you have these options up front. Then once you choose one of those options, even during the selection process, you don't know how hard it is. You kind of have to decide, how hard do I think it will be to break down this door versus to lockpick this door? And B, what are my current skills for those mechanisms? Am I really strong? Am I good at fighting or forceful skill tests? Or am I smarter? Am I better easier to calculate how to unlock this lock? So you're compiling your information that you know about your character and just kind of real life skills. How hard do I think it would be to pick a lock versus knock down a door? So I like that about it. And then the actual skill test, you get to decide how many dice you're going to roll. So you have these 2 dice that you always roll. Let's see if I can get them. They're kind of deep in the box right now. You have these 2 dice that you always roll. They're beautiful dice. And then you have some other purple dice that you can roll if you want, but you don't have to because they are kind of slow to refresh. If you roll them, then they're not there for another skill test in the future until you refresh them. The number that you roll then looks at little tokens that are on these rolls. So say I decide to break down that door, and I have a little token on the 4 slot and the 6 slot and the 12 slot of this red skill test field, and I roll 7. Say I roll 7. What I do is I look at every token that is equal to or less than 7 on this track. And so in this case, I had a token at 6 and a token at 4, so I have 2 successes. And say one of those purple dice that I rolled also has a success on it, because they do have an automatic success. That equals 3 successes. And I'll type into the app, it's an app-driven game, I'll type in 3 successes. And it tells me how well I do, because there are varying degrees of success in Destinies. Like I said, I don't know, you don't know going into it how hard it will be, but you also don't know exactly what the outcome will be. So 3 success might be really good. Generally, that is pretty good. But even if I only had like a 1, that might move the door a little bit closer to being knocked down. Maybe I don't knock down the door, but I might have a little bit of adrenaline flowing, and maybe if I try again, I'll have a better chance of doing it. But it might cost a little extra time or an extra turn or something like that. But I love the varying degrees of success. And I also love these little tokens that I mentioned here. I love that during the game, you can manipulate them quite a bit. You can make these tokens go down. You can make like the lowest token go down to guarantee yourself that you're always going to get a success. Or you can take this token that was all the way over here at the 12 and you can move it down, so maybe you can increase the chances of getting more successes in the game. There's also cards that you can gain in Destinies that impact the outcome. So after you do all this stuff and you're like, shoot, I only got 2 successes. Instead of typing 2 successes into the app, I could say discard a card to add an automatic 2 successes if that card says that. So I like that there are built-in ways to change the outcome after you already know how many successes you have. The only reason this game isn't higher on this list, because all these things combine together into a really satisfying mechanism, the only reason it isn't higher is that there isn't a built-in way in the game for you to do what I just described with the cards. If you don't have a card that can help you with the outcome, there's nothing you can do. There's no built-in core mechanism that allows you to do that. But it's that's a very nitpicky thing. Altogether, this skill test mechanism is really, really cool. That is Destinies, my number 4 game on this list. I could see that even going up even higher later. But these top 5 are really, really good skill test mechanisms. At number 3 is A Feast for Odin. I almost sometimes forget how much of a skill test game A Feast for Odin is, because there's a lot of other stuff going on. It's a heavy Euro game, it's a polyomino game, it's a feed your workers game, a worker placement game. But there are 2 different distinct types of skill tests in the game. One in which you are rolling some dice and trying to get the highest number, because the higher the number, the better the artifact or treasure you can get as a result. So you're kind of going treasure hunting. I think it's pillaging. You're going pillaging, and you're getting a better treasure. So you're trying to get a higher number, and that gives you still get and again, variable outcomes here, because if I roll a 7, I can choose from treasures that are valued at 7 or less, if available. But if I get a 12, I can look at artifacts that are 12 or less. So there's still options to choose from depending on your outcome. On the converse, there's also skill tests, hunting skill tests, where you are trying to essentially reduce the animal's life to 0. So you're trying to roll a lower number in these skill tests. And then you're trying to reduce whatever number you roll to 0. So if I roll a 2, that's a pretty good roll, and then I can make that number go even lower by spending a specific weapon and or stone, any combination of a specific weapon and or stone. And that also goes for the pillaging. You can spend a specific weapon and or stone to increase the die roll number for those skill tests. I also really like in A Feast for Odin that you get multiple rolls. You can roll the die up to 3 times. And so that first roll, you're not locked into it. You can try again. So it's like you're kind of in this, you're hunting this animal. Sure, you jab it at once, maybe you miss, or maybe you're satisfied with that jab and you can stick with it. Or you can re-roll a couple times and get a better roll for A Feast for Odin. And last, it also has kind of an engine building style mitigation for, I believe, the pillaging test. It could be either or both of these tests, where you can put ore on the boats that you use to go do these tests, and that ore automatically increases or impacts the number that, I can't remember if it's an increase or decrease, but it's a built-in thing. The ore just stays there on the boat and impacts that number from then on. So there's an engine building aspect to it as well, a permanent way to increase your skill at that type of test. So lots of really cool skill test mechanisms and a little bit of push your luck going on in A Feast for Odin. by number 3. And number 2 is near and far. Near and far does almost everything that I love about skill tests. So in near and far, the core idea is that you might encounter a skill test. Usually it's combat, but there are a few different types where you encounter something that you need the number 4 to defeat this band of bandits, say. And the skill needed is combat, is fight, is swords. And you have 2 swords. So 2 isn't higher than 4, so you don't accomplish this test by default. Instead, you roll a die, you roll a d6, and I believe it's a d6 actually. It might be a higher die, but I believe it's a d6. And you add that number to your core skill. So you have this core skill that you can build up. You can do some engine building there to have a better core skill. And then you add a random and uncertain element of this die roll to it. And maybe at that point you have the 4 that you need to accomplish the skill test. Maybe you don't. If you don't, you can then spend your own health. You can spend these hearts. You can spend health to get up to the number that you need to get to. So you have all these different things. You have a choice as to your input, as to which character basically that you're using for this test. You have a random element, the die roll, and you have and also your input choices. Which test do you want? There might be a couple different types of bandits on the board. Do you want to go for the easy one or the harder one? You have that choice. And then you have an output sacrifice, something that you can impact the output of the test, where after you know the outcome, what the outcome will be, you can have this certain element, these hearts that you can spend. The reason it's the sacrifice in near and far is that you need those hearts to go to journey farther as you venture out on the map. You need them. And so it is definitely a sacrifice. It means that you can spend less time out on the map and you have to go back to the town sooner if you do that. And I love that. I love all 3 of those elements, how they combine together. I guess the one thing that it doesn't have is variable outcomes. It's a binary yes or no answer. But I think oftentimes with these skill tests, you either need an output sacrifice or a variable outcome on the back end. You don't necessarily need them both. So I really love how all those elements combine in near and far. At number 1, I have a fairly new game on this list. Here's the box right here. Number 1, I have Tidal Blades. There's so many interesting layers and choices and things that can happen in skill tests and Tidal Blades. I'll try to describe it in brief here, but I also have a video about it if you want to go more in detail. So say you have this skill test. You have last one standing. I believe this is the simplest test. Let me see if I can get the camera to show it here. But in this test, I need 1 of this skill to pass the test. That's it. And I get to choose going into the test. I have a choice going into the test. I get to look at this dial up here to determine how many dice I get to roll for that for this test. So it says that's just what this dial means. That's the number of dice that you can roll for any skill test. Also, I can add a fruit. I can pay a fruit. So there's a resource to impact the input, the number of dice that I'm putting into this roll. So if I have, say I can roll 3 dice by default, I think that's where I am right now on the dial. I can pay a fruit to add another die to that to this skill test. So I roll 4 dice, and I won't even go to the dice. The dice are a whole other engine building thing where you can get better and better dice by dice that focus on specific skills. That's a whole other thing. Say I choose the 4 dice I get to roll. I roll those 4 dice, and say I get this icon. I've passed the test. That's all I really need to pass that test. And in doing so, I will increase this skill, this specific skill, by 1, and I get to keep this card, and this card is a little benefit in a few different ways. It's good to pass skill tests. But, however, I didn't roll this other icon over here in the first roll. And the nice thing about Tidal Blades is that you can re-roll as much as you want. But every time you re-roll, you must also roll one of these challenge dice. That there's a couple of them in the bag. They get worse over the course of the game. So things get more difficult as the game ramps up. So every time you re-roll, even though you can re-roll any number of times to try to get the second icon, the reason that you would want to get the second icon is because, as I said, for every icon on this card that you match with your roll, you get to increase your skill of that thing. You get more and more experience for doing it. So not only do you accomplish the skill test, but you have the potential to get even an extra skill of that type after the skill test. And not all cards are like this. Many of the cards have multiple different skills on here that you need to match up. But every time you re-roll, you have to roll these challenge dice, and they can hurt you. They can deal damage to you, basically. However, and this is why the skill test, it sounds like a lot, but it actually, all this happens rather very, very quickly in the game. depending on what you roll there, if you take a damage, if you take 2 damage, you get these shells, and you put these shells on your shell shield, oddly named shell shield, and as you reach certain thresholds of shells, you on that shell shield, you can spend those shells to gain other bonuses, to gain special bonuses. So even as you are getting damage, even as you're pushing your luck and taking damage, which doesn't feel great, you are getting something that will eventually be useful for you. So on every level, I find this skill test incredibly satisfying. There's the engine building side of it. There's the input choice of do I add an extra die? Do I pay food to add an extra dice to the roll? Am I satisfied when I get the core skill required or skills, or do I push my luck and try to get more skills? And then on the back end, even as I'm taking damage for pushing my luck a little bit, I'm building towards something that will be better later in the game, or even later in the skill test if I want. So many awesome levels to the skill test mechanism in Tidal Blades. Yeah. I want to end. Let's see. I don't know if I want to go too deep into. No, I won't go into the game that I'm designing. I'm designing a game that has skill tests, so it's been on my mind a lot lately, as it was when I originally had my skill test video. But I did want to kind of summarize the 4 stages, I think, of a great skill test. This is just my opinion. I know there are lots of games that do not use these at all. But the first is input choice, that you have some choice as to how much you're putting into the skill test up front. That's the first element. The second element is that there's a random element. And generally, I prefer random elements that impact, that kind of are the player rolling for themselves, rather than operating in AI, having an AI element. I think it's just more satisfying to have your own random thing that you're determining, rather than randomly seeing how strong the AI is. But have some element of uncertainty of randomness. And then after you have this information, you know how much you put in and what your outcome of that input is, and you know the random element, you know the outcome of that you also have a kind of an output choice, something that you can sacrifice, or kind of a backup that you contribute to the skill test to get yourself up to a certain threshold if you want to sacrifice that thing. So there's a choice before the test, there's a choice after the test, before you finalize the outcome. And then optionally, step 4 is that there are variable outcomes. I don't think this is always necessary, especially if you do have this output sacrifice choice, but the variable outcomes, varying degrees of success, I think can also be really helpful for these skill tests. Those are the 4 things that I love to see in skill tests, or at least have the first 3, or some combination of 1, 2, and then 3 or 4. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. This is a big, I think, important mechanism for tabletop games. There are lots of different ways to do it, and I'd love to hear some of your favorite examples in the comments below. Thanks.